Sheriff Boone Carter pushed through the crowd that had gathered on Main Street, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. 20 years of keeping peace in Millbrook had taught him to read dangerous situations. But this one made no sense. Two massive native warriors, each standing well over 6 feet, knelt in the dirt before little Finn Talbot like he was some kind of chief. The boy stood perfectly still, his bare toes poking through holes in his worn shoes, studying the giants with the serious expression of someone much older. His mother, Clara Bell, would be washing clothes at the river until sunset, unaware that her son had become the center of the strangest standoff anyone had ever witnessed. "Back away from the child," Carter called out, his voice carrying across the silent street. Neither warrior looked up. They kept their eyes fixed on Finn, speaking in their native tongue with an urgency that made the sheriff's skin crawl. Mrs. Fletcher clutched her husband's arm. Those savages could snap that boy in half. Her whisper carried further than she intended, causing several townspeople to take another step backward. But Finn didn't move. He tilted his head, listening intently as the first warrior pointed toward the distant mountains, then pressed his massive hand against his own chest. The gesture was unmistakable. He was trying to communicate something important. The second warrior, younger but equally imposing, reached slowly into a leather pouch at his side. Carter's gun cleared its holster instantly. "Don't move another muscle." The warrior froze, his hand halfway into the pouch. He looked at Finn with desperate eyes, as if the child was his only hope of avoiding bloodshed. Finn glanced at the sheriff, then back at the warrior, and gave the slightest nod. The warrior's relief was visible as he carefully withdrew his hand, revealing a small object wrapped in deerskin. He placed it gently on the ground between himself and the boy, then backed away on his knees. Finn walked forward and picked up the bundle. As he unwrapped it, gasps echoed through the crowd. Inside was a piece of metal unlike anything they had seen. Not silver, not gold, but something that caught the sunlight and threw it back in strange patterns. The boy examined the object for a long moment, turning it over in his small hands. When he looked up at the warriors, his expression had changed. There was recognition there, and something else that made Carter's blood run cold. Understanding. Finn wrapped the metal back in its deerskin covering and tucked it inside his shirt. He spoke for the first time since the warriors had arrived, his voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I know where it came from." The first warrior's eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to hope. But before anyone could ask what the boy meant, the sound of hoofbeats thundered down the street, and Mayor Davidson rode up with 6 armed men behind him. Mayor Davidson's horse reared as he pulled hard on the reins, his face red with anger and fear. Behind him, 6 of the town's most trusted men held rifles pointed directly at the kneeling warriors. The crowd pressed backward, sensing that whatever strange peace had existed moments before was about to shatter. "Get away from that child now," Davidson shouted, his voice cracking with authority and terror. "Boone, what in blazes are you doing? Shoot them." Sheriff Carter kept his weapon trained on the warriors but didn't fire. Something about this situation felt wrong, and 30 years of living on the frontier had taught him to trust his instincts. The warriors hadn't made a single aggressive move. If they wanted to hurt anyone, they could have done it already. Finn stepped between the guns and the warriors, his small frame barely reaching their shoulders as they knelt. The sight of a 5-year-old boy protecting 2 massive native fighters struck everyone silent. Even Davidson's bluster died in his throat. "They're hurt," Finn said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Look at their hands." For the first time, people noticed what the boy had seen immediately. Dark stains covered both warriors' palms and fingers, not war paint, but dried blood. Their clothes, which had seemed threatening from a distance, were torn and dirty from hard travel. These weren't raiders or attackers. They were refugees. The first warrior spoke again, his deep voice rumbling with pain and exhaustion. He gestured toward the mountains, then pointed at the metal object hidden beneath Finn's shirt. The boy nodded and turned to face the crowd. "He says his people are trapped," Finn announced, his words sending a chill through every person present. "Something happened up there. Something bad." "How could you possibly know what he's saying?" Davidson demanded, dismounting but keeping his distance. Finn's answer came so simply that it hit like a physical blow. "My daddy taught me." Clara Bell's husband had been dead for 3 years, killed in a mining accident when Finn was barely 2. No one in town remembered him well enough to know he might have learned native languages. But there was something in the boy's eyes, a certainty that made even the most skeptical faces in the crowd begin to doubt their assumptions. The second warrior reached for his pouch again, moving slowly enough that no one felt threatened. This time he withdrew a small piece of bark covered in charcoal markings. He handed it to Finn, who studied the crude map with the intensity of a scholar. The boy's face went pale as he traced the marks with his finger. When he looked up, there was fear in his eyes for the first time since the warriors had arrived. "We have to help them," he whispered. "If we don't, everyone in the mountains is going to die." But before anyone could ask what he meant, the unmistakable sound of war drums began echoing from the distant peaks. The war drums echoed across the valley like thunder that refused to end, each beat growing louder and more urgent. Women gathered their children close while men checked their weapons, all eyes turning toward the mountain peaks where smoke had begun to rise against the afternoon sky. The two warriors still knelt in the dirt, but now their desperation was unmistakable. Mayor Davidson backed toward his horse, his earlier bravado evaporating with each drum beat. "This is a trap," he declared, his voice shaking. "They're signaling their war party. We need to get everyone to the fort." But Finn stepped forward, the bark map still clutched in his small hands. "No," he said with a firmness that seemed impossible from someone so young. "The drums aren't calling for war, they're calling for help." Sheriff Carter lowered his weapon slightly, studying the boy's face. 3 years of watching Finn grow up without a father had taught him to recognize when the child was telling the truth. "How can you be sure, son?" "Because my daddy told me about the different drum patterns." Finn's voice grew quieter as he spoke of his father, but his certainty never wavered. "These drums are desperate. They're the same pattern tribes use when their village is under attack and they need allies." The first warrior nodded vigorously at Finn's words, then pointed again toward the mountains. He spoke rapidly in his native tongue, gesturing at the crude map, and then at the metal object still hidden beneath the boy's shirt. Even without understanding the language, everyone could hear the urgency in his voice. Mrs. Fletcher grabbed her husband's sleeve. "What if the boy's wrong? What if this is exactly what they want us to think?" Before anyone could answer, a new sound joined the drumming. Distant screams carried on the wind, faint but unmistakably human. The cries of women and children in terror, echoing from somewhere high in the mountains where no white settlers were supposed to live. The second warrior struggled to his feet, swaying from exhaustion and whatever injuries he carried. He looked directly at Mayor Davidson and spoke a single word in clear English: "Please." The simple plea struck everyone silent. Here was a man who could have demanded, threatened, or taken what he needed by force. Instead, he was begging, the blood on his hands, the tears in his clothes, the exhaustion in his eyes. It all told the same story. Whatever was happening in the mountains had driven these proud warriors to the most desperate act imaginable, asking their enemies for help. Finn folded the bark map carefully and tucked it inside his shirt next to the metal object. When he looked up at the assembled crowd, his young face carried a determination that belonged on someone 3 times his age. "I'm going with them," he announced. "They need someone who can talk to both sides." But before anyone could protest, Clarabelle's voice cut through the crowd like a whip crack, and everyone turned to see Finn's mother running toward them with terror written across her face. Clarabelle pushed through the crowd with the desperation of a mother who had already lost too much. Her dress was soaked from washing clothes at the river, and her face carried the same terror that had marked her the day they brought news of her husband's death. But this fear was different, more immediate. "Finn, get away from them right now," she commanded, reaching for her son's arm. But the boy stepped back, positioning himself between his mother and the warriors, with protective instincts that seemed far beyond his years. "Mama, they need our help," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "The metal thing they gave me, it belonged to Daddy." Clarabelle stopped as if she had been struck. Her eyes moved from her son's face to the warriors, then back again. "That's impossible," she whispered, but something in her expression suggested she already knew it wasn't. The first warrior spoke directly to her, his voice gentle despite his imposing size. He used English words mixed with his native tongue, creating sentences that were broken but clear. "Thomas Talbot, good man, saved many, before the rocks fell." The crowd stirred uneasily. Thomas Talbot had died in a mining accident, crushed when a tunnel collapsed. But the way the warrior spoke made it sound like there was more to the story, details that had never been shared with the townspeople. Sheriff Carter stepped closer, his earlier suspicion replaced by growing concern. "Clara, what aren't you telling us? Did Thomas know these people?" Clarabelle's hands shook as she reached out to touch the deerskin pouch where her son had hidden the metal object. "He made trips up to the mountains," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Said he was checking mineral deposits for the mining company, but he always came back with stories about the people up there, how they were trying to survive between the army patrols and the mining operations. The second warrior pulled out another piece of bark, this one marked with different symbols. He showed it to Clarabelle, and her face went white. She recognized whatever message was drawn there. "They're not warriors," she said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. "They're fathers. Their families are trapped in a collapsed mine shaft. The same kind of accident that killed Thomas." The realization hit the crowd like a physical blow. These weren't enemy fighters or raiders. They were desperate men whose children were buried under tons of rock, just like Thomas Talbot had been 3 years ago. Mayor Davidson shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "Even if that's true, what can we do? We don't have mining equipment up there." Finn pulled the metal object from his shirt and unwrapped it slowly. In the afternoon sunlight, everyone could see what it really was. A piece of specialized mining equipment, something designed to shore up tunnel walls, something that could mean the difference between life and death for people trapped underground. "Daddy left this with their tribe," Finn said, his young voice carrying the weight of understanding. He knew someday they might need it. But before anyone could respond, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, racing toward town with news that would change everything. The rider thundered into town covered in dust and sweat, his horse lathered from hard travel. Deputy Marshal Hayes from the territorial capital pulled up short when he saw the crowd gathered around 2 massive native warriors and a small boy. His hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. "Sheriff Carter, what's the situation here?" Hayes demanded, but his eyes never left the warriors. "I passed smoke signals on my way in. The Army's mobilizing 3 companies from Fort Stevens. They'll be here by sundown." A cold dread settled over the crowd. Everyone knew what happened when the Army decided native tribes were hostile. Questions came later, if at all. Mayor Davidson stepped forward eagerly. "Marshal, these 2 showed up this morning making demands. We've been holding them until proper authority arrived." But Sheriff Carter shook his head. "That's not accurate, Hayes. They came asking for help. Their people are trapped in a mine collapse." "A likely story," the deputy marshal replied, dismounting with his rifle in hand. "Command received reports of war drums and smoke signals from this sector. Those are signs of organized hostility." Finn moved closer to the warriors, his small hand resting on the first warrior's massive shoulder. The gesture of protection from such a tiny defender would have been comical under different circumstances, but something about the boy's fierce determination silenced any laughter. "The drums were calling for help, not war," Finn insisted, his young voice cutting through the tension. "And the smoke is from their cooking fires going out because everyone's trapped underground." Clarabelle stepped beside her son, her maternal instincts warring with her fear of authority. "Marshal Hayes, my husband Thomas worked with these people before he died. They're not hostile. They're desperate." The deputy marshal's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I've got orders to secure any native insurgents and await military arrival. These 2 are coming with me." But as Hayes moved forward with restraints, the first warrior spoke rapidly to his companion in their native tongue. The second warrior nodded grimly and began removing something from around his neck, a small leather cord with an object attached. "Stop right there," Hayes shouted, raising his rifle. The warrior ignored the weapon and handed the cord to Finn. Hanging from it was a military identification tag, worn and scratched but still readable. The name stamped into the metal made Clarabelle gasp. "Thomas Talbot, Finn's father. He gave this to our chief," the warrior said in careful English. "Said if anything happened to him we should find his son. Said the boy would understand." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Thomas Talbot hadn't just been helping the tribes informally. He had given them his identification, creating an official connection that changed everything about this situation. But before anyone could process what this meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air, and a dust cloud on the horizon revealed that the Army was arriving ahead of schedule. Colonel Morrison rode at the head of 30 cavalry soldiers, their blue uniforms and gleaming weapons creating a formidable sight as they approached Millbrook's main street. The thunder of hooves and jangle of equipment announced their arrival long before they pulled up in formation around the crowd. Morrison's weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene. "Deputy Marshal Hayes, report," the colonel commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. Hayes snapped to attention. "Sir, 2 hostile natives appeared in town this morning making demands. Local sheriff has been preventing proper detention pending your arrival." Sheriff Carter stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Colonel, that's not the full situation. These men came seeking help for their people trapped in a mine collapse. They have a legitimate claim for assistance based on prior arrangements with Thomas Talbot." Colonel Morrison's eyes moved to the military identification tag hanging around Finn's neck. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been regret. "Thomas Talbot was a good man," he said quietly, "but he's been dead for 3 years, and his promises died with him." The first warrior struggled to his feet, ignoring the rifles trained on him from every direction. He spoke directly to the colonel in broken English, his deep voice carrying desperate urgency. "Children trapped, no food, no air. Need help now or they die." "That's not our concern," Morrison replied coldly. "My orders are to pacify hostile elements in this territory. 2 armed warriors appearing in a white settlement constitutes a threat that requires immediate action." Finn stepped between the colonel's horse and the warriors, his small frame barely reaching the animal's chest. The sight of a 5-year-old boy confronting 30 armed soldiers created a moment of stunned silence. "My daddy made a promise," Finn said, his young voice steady despite the overwhelming odds facing him. "He told them if they ever needed help, they could come to his family. That means me." Colonel Morrison looked down at the boy with something approaching respect. "Son, I understand you want to honor your father's memory, but this is a military matter now. These men are coming with us." Clara Bell moved to stand beside her son, her hands trembling but her voice firm. "Colonel, if you take them, innocent children will die in those mountains. That's not justice. That's not what Thomas would have wanted." The colonel's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I have my orders. Stand aside." But Finn didn't move. Instead, he pulled the mining equipment from his shirt and held it up for everyone to see. "This is what they need to save their people. My daddy left it with them because he knew someday this would happen." The colonel stared at the specialized tool, recognition dawning in his eyes. He knew enough about mining to understand what the device could mean for people trapped underground. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant war drums, still echoing desperately from the mountains. Colonel Morrison stared at the mining tool in Finn's small hands, and for the first time since arriving, uncertainty flickered across his weathered features. 25 years of military service had taught him to recognize specialized equipment, and what the boy held was worth more than its weight in gold to people trapped underground. "Where exactly did your father get this?" the colonel asked, his voice losing some of its harsh authority. "He designed it," Clara Bell answered, stepping closer to support her son. "Thomas was an engineer before he became a miner. He created tools to prevent cave-ins and rescue people when they happened." The first warrior nodded vigorously and spoke rapidly to his companion, who immediately began drawing new symbols in the dirt with his finger. The crude map showed tunnel layouts, air pockets, and exactly where people were trapped. It was detailed enough that even Colonel Morrison could understand the desperate situation. Sheriff Carter moved closer to examine the drawings. "Colonel, this isn't a military threat. This is a humanitarian crisis. Those drums we've been hearing aren't war signals. They're counting down time until the air runs out." The deputy marshal shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, orders are orders. We can't set precedent by negotiating with hostile natives." But Finn looked up at Colonel Morrison with eyes that held far too much wisdom for a 5-year-old. "My daddy said the Army's job was to protect people. All people. He said that's what made America different." The words hit their mark. Morrison dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling as his boots touched the ground. He knelt to Finn's eye level, studying the boy's face with the intensity of a man making a decision that would define his career. "Son, if I allow this rescue mission, I'm putting my soldiers at risk for people who aren't American citizens. I need you to understand what you're asking." Finn held the mining tool tighter. "I understand, sir, but if we don't try, children are going to die. And my daddy always said children don't have countries. They just have families who love them." The colonel looked at the warriors, still kneeling in the dirt despite being surrounded by armed soldiers. Their desperation was genuine, their need undeniable. He thought of his own children back east, safe in their beds, and imagined them trapped underground with air running out. "Sergeant Mills," he called to his second-in-command, "select 6 men with mining experience. We're going to the mountains." Deputy Marshal Hayes stepped forward in protest. "Colonel, this exceeds your authority." Morrison stood and faced the deputy marshal with steel in his eyes. "Marshal, my authority extends to protecting American interests." If helping these people prevents a larger conflict, that serves America. If you have objections, file them with Territorial Command after we return." But as the rescue party began organizing, none of them noticed the small group of riders watching from the distant hills. 3 hours later, the rescue party returned to Millbrook with 17 native children and 8 adults, all alive but exhausted from their underground ordeal. The specialized mining tool that Thomas Talbot had designed years earlier had worked exactly as intended, allowing the soldiers to shore up the collapsed tunnel long enough for everyone to escape. Finn stood in the town square, still wearing his father's military identification tag, watching as Dr. Williams examined the rescued children. The 2 warriors who had knelt before him that morning now stood tall and proud, their desperation replaced by overwhelming gratitude. The first warrior approached the boy and spoke in careful English. "Thomas Talbot's son saved my daughter," he said, gesturing to a girl about Finn's age who was drinking water and laughing with relief. "My people will never forget." Colonel Morrison dismounted and walked over to where Finn stood with his mother. The hardened military officer looked different now, his stern expression softened by what he had witnessed in the mountains. "Son, what you did today took more courage than most soldiers show in their entire careers." The distant riders who had been watching from the hills finally approached the town. They were tribal elders, led by an ancient chief whose weathered face broke into a smile when he saw the rescued children. He rode directly to Finn and dismounted slowly, his aged joints protesting the movement. Speaking in accented but clear English, the chief addressed the crowd. 3 winters ago, Thomas Talbot came to our mountains. He saw our people struggling to survive between army patrols and mining claims. He promised if we ever needed help, his family would remember. The chief reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn from handling, but still intact. He handed it to Clara Bell, who gasped as she recognized her husband's handwriting. It was a letter, written before Thomas died, explaining his work with the mountain tribes and asking his family to honor his commitments if anything happened to him. Mayor Davidson stepped forward, shame evident on his face. "We were wrong to assume the worst. This town owes you all an apology." Sheriff Carter nodded in agreement. "And we owe this young man a debt we can never repay." He placed his hand on Finn's shoulder. "Your father would be proud of the man you're becoming." As the sun set over Millbrook, the tribal elders set up a temporary camp just outside town. For the first time in years, there was peace between the communities. The children played together while adults shared food and stories, building bridges that would last for generations. Finn sat with his mother on their front porch, the specialized mining tool resting safely inside their home, along with his father's letter. Clara Bell had tears in her eyes as she watched her son, understanding for the first time the full extent of Thomas's legacy. "Mama," Finn said quietly, "do you think Daddy knew this would happen?" Clara Bell smiled and pulled her son close. "I think your father knew that someday you'd be brave enough to do the right thing, even when it was scary." The war drums had fallen silent. In their place, the sound of laughter echoed across the valley as 2 communities began the long process of learning to trust each other. And at the center of it all was a poor 5-year-old boy who had proven that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.